Welcome, welcome to Jerusalem for those who've come from outside Jerusalem. As you can see, the weather is very nice and things are very pleasant. The fact that today we're discussing various aspects of Jerusalem wasn't planned to occur at the same time as the present events that are going on and the general background that we have in the last couple of weeks, or even more. But nevertheless, it perhaps stresses the fact that whether Jerusalem is in the news or isn't in the news, the problem of Jerusalem is a classical hot potato that's been on the agenda between the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, the Arab people, and the Christian people for hundreds of years. And it's come to the fore and it's gone to the background, but it's still there and it's still here today, and it's still something that ultimately the question is whether we can address it or not, and we can address it, but whether we can solve it or not. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Alan Baker. I'm the director of the Institute for Contemporary Affairs at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs here. Let me just acknowledge Chaya Hershkovitz. She's the Director General of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and my distinguished representative, Ambassador Freddie Eitan, from a former ambassador of Israel in several countries, and presently an active fellow here at the Jerusalem Center, and of course to welcome everybody else. Today we're going to divide our briefing into two. We've invited a very old friend of mine, Advocate Michal Navoth, who's developed quite an expertise in various fields of international law, and especially the field of jurisprudence, international jurisprudence regarding Jerusalem. And she'll open our discussions today on a brief analysis of a paper that she's written, an excellent paper which will be appearing within the next few days on the legal status of Jerusalem in United States jurisprudence and policy. And this in particular is based on a recent judgment of the US Supreme Court. You're probably aware of it when somebody asked to have their passport registered in their passport that this boy was born in Jerusalem, Israel, and the State Department refused to do it. So Advocate Navoth is going to give us a brief explanation on this and general U.S. policy. After that, I will continue with a wider overview of the basic question, is Jerusalem negotiable? And it's based on a booklet that I published in 2003, which you can find here, going by the same name, which basically summarizes the question of Jerusalem in international law. In other words, in the United Nations, the background to the United Nations references to Jerusalem, and the various proposals that have been made regarding solving the issue of Jerusalem. Though some of you might have attended a very important event that we had a few days ago on Thursday evening, where we had Nadav Shragai, another great expert in Jerusalem, who presented his recent book, which is also, which I have here. It's in Hebrew, but the translated version appears on our website, called Jerusalem Ashlayat HaChalukah, the delusion of division. And it analyzes in very great detail the pros and cons of whether it's possible at all to divide up Jerusalem from economic aspects, national aspects, religious aspects, and all other aspects. So, all in all, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, as its name implies, has been involved very heavily over the last week specifically on various key issues regarding Jerusalem at a time when the Jerusalem is literally in the international news. So without more ado, let me let me welcome Michal Navoth. Just a few words about her. Michal publishes in English and gives lectures in various local and international forums on subjects regarding legal aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict, human rights, anti-Semitism, and has an expertise on legal aspects of events, especially in Greece. She's the Secretary General of the Israeli branch of the United Nations Association, and as such she attends meetings throughout the world of the United Nations Association representing Israel. Thank you. Michal, the floor is yours. You want to come here? Or
I prefer you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Baker and Mrs. Hershkovitz, and members of the JCPA, and thank you all of you. As both of you indicated, the subject is very timely. You said the hot batata, and Mrs. Hershkovitz said, Yerushalayim al Rosh Simchatenu. And I, as it was mentioned, explored the issue of the status of Jerusalem in U.S. foreign policy as it was expressed in a very important judgment that was rendered recently by the United States Supreme Court. When I say the court, I will refer to the United States Supreme Court. On June 8 this year, 2015, as the court in the case of Menachem Zavitovsky versus Kerry, Secretary of State, rendered that Section 214 of the Foreign Relations Authorization Act is unconstitutional. Now this section, and I will read it later on, is a statutory provision that requires to record Israel as a place of birth of American citizens born in Jerusalem, if so requested. And the Supreme Court said this section is unconstitutional. The court has two reasons for its conclusion. First of all, the court said that the president, and in that point, this is an unprecedented decision of the Supreme Court. For the first time, United States Supreme Court decided that the American president possesses an exclusive right of recognition, an exclusive right to recognize a formal sovereign. And then, because of that reason, the court held that this section infringed on the executive consistent policy to withhold recognition with respect to Jerusalem. Because, as you know, United States never acknowledged any sovereignty over Jerusalem, whether it's an Israeli sovereignty or any other country sovereignty. So prior to the analysis of the judgment, I will refer very briefly to a recent historical background of Jerusalem, then to the whole issue of sovereignty, and then to the different fluctuation in American foreign policy as far as Jerusalem sovereignty is concerned. From the 16th century on, for over 400 years, Jerusalem, together with the whole of Palestine, was under the Ottoman Empire. The first argument is that Jerusalem was never a capital of any Arab state. And since 1830, Jerusalem has a Jewish majority. At the beginning, it was a relative majority, and now an absolute majority. Going further ahead, and I'm going to UN 1947, November 1947, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, known as a partition plan, when it stipulates that upon the termination of the British mandate, independent Arab and Jewish state and a special international regime for the city of Jerusalem should be established. The city of Jerusalem shall be established as a corpus separatum under a special international regime and shall be administered by the United Nations. Again, a very timely question nowadays. Quite often I'm asked, what is the duration of this corpus separatum? What was planned to be the duration? So it was planned to last for 10 years. After that period, it was supposed to be re-examined on the basis of the experience acquired, and then the citizens of the cities were expected to participate in a referendum, deciding whether they want to leave or to amend the terms of the corpus separatum. The Jewish leadership immediately accepted this partition plan, notwithstanding the fact that it had the limited boundaries for the state of Israel, with the exclusion of Jerusalem, despite Jerusalem's centrality and significance in Jewish history and religion. The Arab immediately rejected the plan, and by that time, United States in the General Assembly adopted the majority position of the General Assembly of the partition plan. As you all know, the partition plan never, or the corpus separatum, the partition plan, never came into being, and later David Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, said at the end of 1949, for me the corpus separatum is null and void, doesn't exist. On May 14, 1948, the Jewish representatives of the Jewish community proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel does not mention Jerusalem. In the very same day, the first state to recognize Israel was the United States. But we should bear in mind that after President Truman's recognition of the State of Israel, or this recognition, let's put it differently, this recognition only referred to the state of Israel. It didn't refer to Jerusalem. And I will explain why. At the same day, in Israel, the war of what we call the War of Independence started, and it lasted till July 1949, when the last of 4 armistice agreements between Israel and Syria was signed. One of the results of this war was that Israel attained control of Western Jerusalem. Then, at the end of 1949, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, when I mentioned his speech a few minutes ago, said in the Knesset, for the state, Jerusalem, first of all, is an inseparable part of the state of Israel. For the state of Israel, however, there has always been and will always be one capital, the eternal Jerusalem. The Knesset approved this position, and you should know that according to international law, one of the prerogatives of a sovereign state is to choose its own capital. The capital itself doesn't possess any rights under international law, but any sovereign state can decide which city will be its capital. And against this background, it's very important to understand the vacuum that was created here in Jerusalem, as is aptly described by a very prominent expert of international law, Professor Elihu Lauterbach, who claimed that with the failure to create or to fulfill the idea of corpus separatum, with the British withdrawal from Palestine, the partition plan had been overtaken by an event, and Jerusalem was left with a vacuum of sovereignty. Israel filled that vacancy by virtue of its lawful right of self-defense. Whereas the Jordanian, who started immediately to attack Jerusalem, both in 1948 and also I will see in 1967, did it in violation of international law, especially violation of the basic rule that prohibit the use of force under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. And thus, Jordan cannot claim any legal title of Jerusalem, because according to a very old rule, no right can be born out of an unlawful action. And that was Jordan did when it attacked Israel, including Western Jerusalem. And the same applied to the 1967 Six-Day War. Again, Israel, by virtue of her inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and here scholars of international law can tell you that in international law textbook, when you want to give an example of the inherent right of self-defense, and all Israeli war and big military operations are based on this explanation of self-defense, the only explanation of self-defense is Israel's behavior in the Six-Day War. When an armed attack occurs, all the events that preceded the war, in the few weeks before it, in May 67, are considered as an armed attack, like the closure of the Tiran Strait, the concentration of major Egyptian military forces in Sinai, the explosion of UNEF, United Nations Emergency Force, from Sinai, etc. As a result of the war, Israel, or Jerusalem, the whole Jerusalem, came under the control and jurisdiction of Israel, because immediately after the war, Israel applied its law, jurisdiction, and administration to Jerusalem. And this is very important as far as American policy is concerned, because from the beginning of the 50s till 1967, more or less, the American policy toward Israel, toward Jerusalem, was constant. Why? Because United States never recognized Western Jerusalem as part of Israel, nor Eastern Jerusalem as part of Jordan. And since 1967, we are witnessing a sharp shift in United States policy toward Jerusalem. A few weeks after the war, then United States ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Arthur Goldberg, in a special emergency session of the General Assembly, made his major policy address regarding Jerusalem, and he said in that address, and I would like you to recall this paragraph, because United States Supreme Court misunderstood it. So here the people in the JCPA will understand it better. And he referred to provisional measures, Ambassador Goldberg, to provisional measures taken by Israel by the end of June, namely the provisional administrative measure, namely the annexation of Jerusalem. And he said that my government does not accept or recognize these measures as altering the status of Jerusalem, and he hoped that any future status of Jerusalem will be negotiated. A few months later, Ambassador Goldberg participated in the drafting of Security Council Resolution 242, November 1967. No surprise, I'm not surprised that all of you know about it, because ever since, this Security Council resolution is considered to be the cornerstone of all the peace initiative and peace treaties between Israel and its neighbors. Now, what did Security Council Resolution 242 tell us about Jerusalem? Ambassador Eitan, you're right. Yes. Exactly, nothing. And according to Ambassador Goldberg, that omission was on purpose. Okay. I'm going almost a decade later, and I'm coming to the Camp David Accords, the two Accords of September 1978. And here again, Jerusalem is not mentioned. However, the three people, now, President Sadat signed the accord in the name of the Republic of Egypt, late Prime Minister Begin on the name of the State of Israel, and President Carter signed for United States as a witness, not as a party. And then the three leaders appended letters to the agreement. I will refer to what President Carter wrote in relation to his country position as far as Jerusalem is concerned. The position of the United States on Jerusalem remains as stated by Ambassador Goldberg in the United Nations General Assembly, what I just read, on July 1967, and subsequently by Ambassador Yost in the United Nations Security Council on July 1st, 1969. With all due respect, President Carter was wrong, because there was a huge differences between Ambassador Goldberg and Ambassador Yost's position. True, both ambassadors stressed that Israel's action in Jerusalem were recognized, were provisional, and that the status of Jerusalem should be settled by negotiation. The difference, however, was that Ambassador Yost considered Jerusalem as an occupied territory to which the 1949 Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilians at time of war was applied. Later on, Ambassador Goldberg referred to that difference in an article published in the New York Times in 1980. And that's what Ambassador Goldberg said, and I think it's a good quotation which explains the fluctuation in the policy. The facts are that I never described Jerusalem as occupied territory. Ambassador Yost did in his speech of July 1969 under instruction from President Nixon, and his statement represented a departure from the policy President Johnson and the Department of State pursued with respect to Jerusalem during the period of my tenure. So here you see you have two presidents, two administrations, different policy. To make it even more complicated, in the years to come, we see that there are differences not only between different administrations, but sometimes between the president and his Secretary of State and the State Department. For example, 1982, the Reagan plan. President Reagan spoke about undivided Jerusalem, although he seemed to be a proponent of the policy of leaving the status of Jerusalem to be dealt later on. Then his Secretary of State, George Shultz, described Jerusalem as an occupied territory. Coming to 1990, United States President George Bush, in a press conference in March 1990, George Bush said that the Jewish settlement in eastern Jerusalem should be treated as the Jewish neighborhood, in the East Jerusalem should be treated as a Jewish settlement in the occupied territories. This, of course, caused a big anger, a considerable anger in Israel and among American Jewry. And the U.S. Congress decided to define U.S. policy in a more categorical way and passed a resolution recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But this resolution was not binding. So it took 5 more years till we came to 1995. And this year it was a good occasion. לא, נציגה מחיפה הגיעה. In the tribute of the 3000th celebration of the anniversary of Jerusalem, Senator Robert Dole and John Keel introduced the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which was adopted as a law. This time it was binding, and it provides to move American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, according to a practice in international law, when a foreign state fears that the establishment of its embassy in Jerusalem might be misconstrued as a recognition of the sovereignty of Jerusalem, there is a solution. It can add a reservation to that effect. In fact, that was the case when many countries did it when they had their embassy in Eastern Berlin regarding the DDR. However, in the case of United States, not only that United States didn't add any disclaimer or reservation, but some of the law section provides the contrary. For example, in the law it says, since 1967, Jerusalem has been a united city administered by Israel. I quote, then timetable. Jerusalem should remain an undivided city in which the rights of every ethnic and religious group are protected. 2. Jerusalem should be recognized as the capital of the State of Israel. And 3. The United States Embassy in Israel should be established in Jerusalem no later than May 31st, 1999. 16 years have lapsed and nothing happened. And in fact, Jerusalem is the only state that United States don't have its embassy in its functioning capital. And that despite the fact that in the law, United States described Jerusalem as its democratic friend and strategic ally. However, according to Section 16, the United States conducts official meeting and other business in Jerusalem in de facto acknowledgement of its status as the capital of Israel. When in 1999, the president, at the end of 1999, the president-elect Bill Clinton, on the eve of his inauguration, was asked when and under what circumstances he will consider to move the embassy to Jerusalem. He said, timing is very important, and I'm afraid that now it will interrupt with the peace process. It is true, timing is very important. And it always depends, and when Clinton people came into the White Office, they softened substantially the policy and the language on Jerusalem. So it always depends whether commitments are made by president-elect or president in office. And now coming to President Obama, or let's go before to Senator Obama. In 2008, in the platform of the Democratic Party, there was a section describing the policy of its candidate to the president. So then Senator Obama said, Jerusalem is and will remain the capital of Israel. In 2012, already being the President of United States and seeking re-election, the sentence was removed. Then at the end of September 2012, when President Obama directed the Democratic Party to reinstate the sentence and again to have the language declaring Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So what we can see about this policy is that not only the fluctuations are between different administrations, between sometimes the president and the State Department, but even the occupant of the White House changes his policy. It all depends whether he states his commitment before or after entering the White House. Then על פסק הדין. 10 דקות על הפסק דין. אוקיי. The judgment concerned a boy by the name of Menachem Zavitovsky, who was born to American parents here in Jerusalem, in Western Jerusalem, in Shaarei Tzedek. He was born on October, he has a bar mitzvah next Saturday. He was born on October 2002, a month after this law that we are at issue, the provision 214 that require to list Israel as a place of birth of Jerusalem, of a citizen born in of American citizen born in Jerusalem, if so requested. And his mother applied for a passport on Menachem's behalf that will record Jerusalem, Israel, as his place of birth. The State Department issued the passport, but recorded only Jerusalem. And then Menachem, by his parents and guardian, appealed, sued, to compel the State Department to comply with the law. This whole saga was up and down the appellate level for 10 years, and eventually, last June, the United States Supreme Court said, as I mentioned before, that that section was unconstitutional. Now, I won't go into the first part of my article because the first part of my article is very important. It deals with an unprecedented question regarding the separation of powers. And I have a lot of criticism regarding this analysis of the court, but I will go to the other two parts of my presentation that refer to the judgment. First of all, my argument is that this section 214 is not about recognition, and it does not change the status of Jerusalem, and it does not give any recognition determination. Eventually, the court itself, the majority opinion of the court, stated that Statute 214 does not implicate recognition. So if this statute in question does not implicate recognition, there is no importance whatsoever that the court held that the statute is valid. If a statute is not about recognition determination, how can it contradict such a determination? It's something unlogical. Then, to be even more specific, the court said that the statute contradicted United States consistent policy regarding its position, namely the neutrality toward Jerusalem. But in my analysis, I showed that United States policy toward Jerusalem was not always neutral. And there are many legal and historical mistakes in the analysis of the court. And the status of Jerusalem should be determined by other legal criteria that have nothing to do to any judgment, let alone a judgment to the contrary. I said before, and I mean in here I quote the court, that President Truman recognized Jerusalem on May 48, but this recognition recognized Israel, but did not recognize Jerusalem. 2 דקות. Extension. No. Okay. It shouldn't worry us. Because, as I said before, on May 14, the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel, a few hours before, also didn't mention Jerusalem. And by the fact that United States recognized Israel, it gave Israel all the rights that a sovereign international entity deserves under international law. And the designation of a name in a passport of an American citizen born in Jerusalem is not one of the ways to extend recognition under international law. The last sentence. The judgment was rendered. That's the highest appeal. We cannot appeal any longer. However, since this year, the issue of Jerusalem will presumably revisited during the presidential campaign. And because the commitment to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel has consistently been on the platform of both parties, Republican and Democrat, one may presume that any new elected president, in order to earn the vote of Israel supporters in the U.S., will be asked by the latter to live up to his or her promises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal. I think you've whetted everybody's appetite to read the more detailed paper that will be published, hopefully within the next few days, because this is a fascinating subject, and I think your analysis is very clear as to the confusion, the internal confusion within the United States, and perhaps a lack of understanding both of the concept of sovereignty and what the significance is of merely an administrative act of registering Jerusalem in a passport. I'd like to, over the next few minutes, extend the whole issue and to take Jerusalem, this ping-pong ball, and put it into a wider context. And just out of curiosity, I drew up a timeline with respect to the extent to which Jerusalem has been a ping pong ball over many, many years. For instance, in 701 BCE, the Assyrians, Sanherib, conquered Jerusalem. In 606 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. In 586, the first temple was destroyed and the population was exiled to Babylon. In 63 BCE, Pompey conquered Jerusalem. In 70 ACE, I get mixed up with these expressions, after the Sphira, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans by Titus. In 135, Bar Kokhba revolution, destruction of the second temple by Hadrian. In the year 637, the Muslims occupied Jerusalem. In 1099, the Crusaders occupied Jerusalem. 1250, the Mamelukes occupied Jerusalem. In 1517, the Ottomans occupied Jerusalem. In 1917, the British occupied Jerusalem, and we have the Balfour Declaration, which again didn't mention Jerusalem. In 1947, the General Assembly resolution regarding the establishment of a corpus separatum in Jerusalem, and this in fact is the first key reference to Jerusalem in an international instrument. 1948, as a result of the 1948-1949, the actual division of Jerusalem between Israel and Jordan. 1950 to 1952, various proposals by the United Nations Trusteeship Council, Sweden, Belgium and the Philippines for internationalization of Jerusalem and division of the city. 1967, the Six-Day War, and 1993, the Oslo Accords, which also refer to Jerusalem, and I'll come to this. So we see that this is something that isn't going to be solved very easily in light of this huge historic baggage. But let's first of all divide up the various references. First of all, let's divide up the Palestinian reference to Jerusalem and Jewish history or heritage. Abu Mazen, on the 21st of August 2012, he said, he referred to the alleged temple, Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And he stated that there will be no peace, security or stability unless the occupation, its settlements and settlers will be evacuated from our holy city and eternal capital of our state. In October 2010, the Palestinians managed to push through a resolution in UNESCO declaring that Rachel's tomb is, in actual fact, the Bilal ibn Rabah Mosque, endorsing a Palestinian claim that first surfaced in 1996, which ignores, in fact, centuries of Muslim tradition, which actually acknowledges the fact that there was a Jewish temple in Jerusalem, but the latest Palestinian narrative is to completely deny this. And this is perhaps most significant in a proposal, a reported proposal that the Palestinians issued or proposed to UNESCO to declare the Western Wall part of the Al-Aqsa complex. And let me just read out what they're saying. The Western Wall is part of Plaza Burak, the Arabic name for the Western Wall. The international community should condemn Israel for allowing citizens to bear arms during the recent violence. The IDF and Israel should be condemned for suppression of the capital of occupied Palestine. Israel should be condemned for excavations at Temple Mount. Israel should be condemned for prohibiting freedom of worship at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and breaking the status quo. Israel should be condemned for allowing Jewish extremists to attack Al-Aqsa. Israel should be condemned for planning to build a cable car to the Western Wall. The Patriarch's Cave and Rachel's Tomb should be declared as part of Palestine. Israel settlers and extremists should be condemned for violence. Whether this will gain ground or not, or just fall by the wayside, it doesn't matter, because this is a sort of indicative of the consistent position of the Palestinians now, who feel that they're on a wave, that they've got the ear of the international community, and in various aspects the international community will give credence to their call. And we're hearing it day to day when you hear the accepted term of art in the United Nations, the occupied Palestinian territories. There's no international law that declares the territories to belong to Palestine. There's no international law declaring the existence of an entity called Palestine. But the international community accept this, and it's become something that nobody really questions. And so we can see that this is something that the Palestinians feel that they have the ear of the international community. Now, with respect to the United Nations, Michal Navoth very accurately summarized the situation of the 1947 Resolution 181, recommending the establishment of an independent Arab and Jewish states. Note, they didn't say Palestinian, they said independent Arab and Jewish states, because there was no such thing as a Palestinian state at that time. And a special international regime for the city of Jerusalem, a corpus separatum. Both the Israelis and the Jordanians didn't like it. Ben Gurion was prepared to accept it because the whole idea was a 10-year interim period after which there'd be some type of voting to see whether it should continue or whether it should become something else. The Arabs the Jordanians immediately rejected it, and King Abdallah said any attempt to impose an international system with respect to Jerusalem will be resisted by force. This same resolution was followed by various ceasefire resolutions and truce resolutions, one of them setting up the United Nations Truce Supervision Observation Force, which, strangely enough, exists today. And there have even been some rumblings over the last couple of days since the French have volunteered their wonderful proposal to bring in international forces to Jerusalem. The French evidently want to restore the situation back to what it was in 1947, 1948. Anybody who looks into what this UNTSO is, in fact, you'll see that it served to deal with the truce. Since the truce is no longer in existence and time has passed, and as Michal said, and as Ben Gurion said, situations have changed and international law has changed, UNTSO has remained within the UN. There's nothing more permanent than what's temporary, and the UN has maintained UNTSO, and to this day there's an UNTSO force in the Sinai monitoring the truce in the Sinai, and they're sitting in Alexandria really doing nothing. There's an UNTSO office in Jerusalem that merely provides unarmed observers to UNIFIL, UNDOF, and other forces in the area, but has got absolutely no mandate or connection to Jerusalem. So I think that these rumblings don't really necessarily shouldn't be taken seriously. Following the 47 General Assembly Partition Resolution, the UN didn't forget the idea of a corpus separatum. In fact, Sweden in 1950 proposed a new resolution to impose the corpus separatum, and to this day, the official foreign policy of Sweden, and they've said so in this room, remains that they recognize and accept the principle of corpus separatum, and this is their basic policy. Similar resolutions were proposed by Belgium and by the Philippines in 1952, internationalization and a corpus separatum, but none of these received any support because the Arabs didn't support it, the Jordanians objected to it, and Israel and the Americans didn't accept it. And then, of course, we have the peace process. And we've heard from Michal the various references to the US position by Ambassador Goldberg in 1967, Ambassador Yost in 1968, and Ambassador Rogers, or Foreign Minister Rogers, I don't remember, in 1969,
Secretary of State.
which Rogers said, we have made clear repeatedly in the past 2.5 years that we cannot accept unilateral actions by any party to decide the final status of the city. We believe its status can be determined only through agreement of the parties concerned, taking into account the interests of other countries in the area and the international community. We believe Jerusalem should be a unified city in which there could no longer be restrictions on movement. There should be open access. Arrangements for administration of the unified city should take into account the interests of all its inhabitants, Jewish, Islamic, Christian communities, and there should be roles both for Israel and Jordan in the civil and religious life of the city. He didn't refer to whether it's occupied territory or not occupied territory. I think this was probably deliberate in order to paste over the conflicts that occurred in the previous statements.
Alan, he did say to make inconsequential changes to the 67 line.
Well, that was a later reference. Cosmic changes, which is very important for me because where I live in Har Adar is one of the areas that was described by Rogers as a cosmetic change, and that was the only reason that I was able to persuade my wife to agree that we should go and live there. Because I said, no, don't worry, it's not going to return. It's a cosmetic change, and the reason is that it's very logical because strategically speaking, I opened my window and I got the whole of Jerusalem underneath me. So in addition to being very beautiful, it's a very strategic area. The next important point, I think, is the letter from Sadat to Jimmy Carter on the 17th of September 1978, where Sadat said, look, Arab Jerusalem is an integral part of the West Bank. Legal and historic Arab rights in the city must be respected and restored, should be under Arab sovereignty. The Palestinian inhabitants of Arab Jerusalem are entitled to exercise their legitimate national rights, being part of the Palestinian people. Security Council resolutions 242 and 267 must be applied with respect to Jerusalem, despite the fact that they don't mention Jerusalem. All the measures taken by Israel to alter the state of the city are null and void and should be rescinded, etc., etc. To which Carter replied, the position of the United States on Jerusalem remains as stated by Ambassador Goldberg and subsequently by Ambassador Yost. So we're back to this situation, and hence the ping-pong reference that I gave beforehand. The next point is 1994 in the relationship between Israel and Jordan. In 1994, prior to the conclusion of the peace talks and the peace treaty with Jordan, Rabin and King Hussein met in Washington and they issued the Washington Declaration, which basically sets out the basic provisions of the peaceful relationship, and in fact ended the state of war between Israel and Jordan. The peace treaty didn't end the state of war because by the time they signed the peace treaty there was no state of war. So it just acknowledged the positive diplomatic and commercial relationship between the two countries. And in this declaration, and it's repeated in the peace treaty, the two parties recognized, quote, the special role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem, and added an undertaking that the Hashemite King of Jordan would be involved in the negotiations, in the peace negotiations on the status of the holy places in Jerusalem. Let me now just make an aside to a very interesting reference to the Vatican. And the Vatican is very relevant today, and I'll explain why. In 1919, Pope Benedict XIV said, and I'll read it out, he said, in a speech to the College of Cardinals, after the British had taken control of Palestine, he said the following, quote, there is one matter on which we are especially anxious, and that is the fate of the holy places, on account of the special dignity and importance for which they are so venerated by every Christian. Who can tell the full story of all the efforts of our predecessors to free them from the dominion of infidels, the heroic deeds and the blood shed by Christians of the West through the centuries? And now that, amid the rejoicing of all good men, they have finally returned to the hands of Christians, our anxiety is most keen as to the decisions which the peace process in Paris is soon to take concerning them. For surely it would be a terrible grief for us and for the Christian faithful if infidels were placed in a privileged and prominent position, much more if those most holy sanctuaries of the Christian religion were given to the charge of non-Christians, quote, unquote. Now this is significant. Why? Because on the February the 15th, 2000, in a basic agreement signed between the PLO and the Vatican recognized the special status for Jerusalem and insisted on any solution, including international guarantees. They didn't say who should be the sovereign over Jerusalem. And a few months ago, on May the 13th, 2015, the Vatican recognized the state of Palestine and signed an agreement with the state of Palestine. This agreement hasn't been published. You can look for it, you won't find it. It merely, and I haven't got it here, but it merely guarantees the rights of Catholics in the state of Palestine, and there's a good reason for this, because, for instance, in Bethlehem, the Palestinians have been slowly taking over church properties and preventing access by Christian priests to the various churches, and they've been confiscating properties. And so the Vatican were very annoyed with us that in our agreements with the Palestinians and in the Oslo Accords we didn't do enough to protect the rights of Christian property, and as if to punish us, then they came to their own independent agreements with the Palestinians, recognizing the state of Palestine and guaranteeing their properties. But again, there's no reference, as far as I know, from the descriptions in the New York Times and the various international media, there's no actual reference to Jerusalem. But there again, knowing the recent position of the Palestinians, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some side letter or secret reference to Jerusalem supporting their basic position and their basic rights. So this is the sort of negotiating history of Jerusalem. What remains, and these are detailed in this paper that I put out, which is available here, entitled "Is Jerusalem Really Negotiable? An Analysis of Jerusalem's Place in the Peace Process," a series of proposals by various people, by various bodies. Is that a sign of your objection to what I'm saying? And I'll just briefly go over them, and you can find them, and you can read the specific proposals. In 1988, Walid Khalidi proposed the designation of West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, extraterritorial status and access to the holy places assured, and a grand ecumenical council to represent the three monotheistic faiths with rotating chairmanship to oversee religious harmony. 1992, blueprint for Jerusalem was developed by the former Jerusalem Municipal Council member Moshe Aviram in association with Israeli and Palestinian intellectuals, proposing an enlarged Greater Jerusalem and an overall council comprising 20 municipal units, each under the sovereignty of their respective side, and a joint metropolitan council. 1992, Adnan Abu Odeh proposed two capitals in an undivided Jerusalem, dividing sovereignty over urban areas outside the walls of the old city, based on the demographic nature of the population, with no state having political sovereignty over the walled city, which would belong to the world, and to the three religions, governed by a council representing the highest religious authorities. You can see the pattern that comes out of these various proposals. 1993, Hannah Senora, editor-in-chief of El Fajr, proposed based on the partition plan, that all institutions of both peoples be located in Greater Jerusalem area. West Jerusalem will have the Knesset and other government institutions. East Jerusalem will be the Palestinian National Council, Palestinian government, and all institutions. Mutual agreement between the two countries to suspend the issue of sovereignty over the entire area of the Greater Jerusalem and Metropolitan Council of Jerusalem. And I'll tell you a story about that later, if I have time. 1994, the Palestinian Center for Research, Israel Palestinian Center for Research and Information, IPCRI, proposed a geographically undivided city, politically divided into two capitals with two sovereignties, two municipal administrations. 1995, Beilin Abu Mazen plan, secret Stockholm channel on permanent status run by Deputy Foreign Minister Yossi Beilin and Arafat's deputy Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen, joint working paper, proposed Palestinian capital in Abu Dis, joint administration of expanded city, incorporating Palestinian and Israeli neighborhoods, each serving the respective national capital, guaranteeing Jerusalem as an open and undivided city. The ultimate sovereignty would be determined by the parties in subsequent negotiations. Palestinian flag, not a Jordanian flag, would fly in the area of Temple Mount. February 15th, 2000, basic agreement between the Holy See and the PLO, which I described, special statute for Jerusalem, internationally guaranteed, which should provide for freedom of religion and equality, etc., etc. May 2000, Gershon Baskin, co-director of IPCRI, proposed scattered sovereignty. Israel's sovereignty over the Western Wall and the Jewish quarter and the Israeli neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, Ramat Eshkol, French Hill, East Talpiot, Gilo, security arrangements, guarantee that the city will remain open, limitations on Palestinian building and digging on Temple Mount, boundaries of East Jerusalem and the boundaries of will be the June 67 boundaries or lines based on Resolution 242. Jerusalem will remain open. Palestinians will agree to relinquish their sovereignty over the Western Wall and entrance to the Western Wall, to the Jewish quarter and Old City. The Temple Mount, Haram el-Sharif, will continue to be under the control of the Muslim Waqf, which will not build any buildings on the mount or engage in any digging under the mount unless mutually agreed. Interesting proposal. And then, of course, we have the December 2000 Clinton parameters. Palestinian sovereignty over the Haram and Israel sovereignty under the Western Wall and the space sacred to Judaism, of which it is part, the Western Wall and the Holy of Holies, of which it is part, and a firm commitment by both not to excavate beneath the Haram or behind the wall. Another option Clinton proposed was Palestinian sovereignty over the Haram and Israeli sovereignty over the Western Wall and shared functional sovereignty. And then an interesting thing, when I was ambassador in Canada, the Munk Centre of the University of Toronto, in coordination with the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs, came up with a plan which included the participation by Gilad Sher and others, who Gilad Sher was one of Ehud Barak's chief negotiators and assistants, establishment of an interim special regime within the framework of a two-state solution, with Yerushalayim, quote-unquote, and Al-Quds as their capitals, appointment of an international respected individual, possibly nominated by the quartet, as administrator with executive powers, a governing council composed of Israelis, Palestinians, and outside representatives drawn from countries acceptable, responsibility in the hands of the administrator and the council for security, law enforcement, public services, infrastructure, residency, property ownership, legal regime, zoning, and building. Establishment of a single old city police force composed of internationals, Israeli and Palestinians. International agencies would transfer offices to Jerusalem area to provide economic stabilization and encourage political stability. They asked me, well, what do I think? So I said, well, look, you're basically coming back to the corpus separatum. And they were very offended, and as I was still ambassador, so I didn't want to be declared persona non grata. But this is a proposal which the Canadians are still plying in as much as they're involved in the activities of the quartet. Ruth Lapidot and Dr. Amnon Ramon for the Jerusalem Institute here, not far from us, proposed in 1910 the historic basin of Jerusalem, problems and possible solutions, and they recommended international involvement on the assumption that it would improve the chances of reaching agreement in light of the mistrust between the sides, as well as the cultural religious importance. Neither side would be required to relinquish sovereignty. So there's an unexplained acknowledgement of Palestinian sovereignty, thereby enabling a long-term interim arrangement until sides build up mutual trust needed for achieving a permanent agreement. So this is where we stand at the moment. Let me just tell you one story, and then I'll end. When we were negotiating with Yasser Arafat and Abu Mazen on the issue of the final status, one of the basic agenda items of the Oslo Accords, the final status agreement, is quote unquote the issue of Jerusalem, together with refugees, settlements, water, security. The issue of Jerusalem, it's not the issue of East Jerusalem, it's not the issue of West Jerusalem, it's the issue of Jerusalem, which of course the Palestinians say, well, this is the whole of Jerusalem, this is East and West Jerusalem. This means that Israel agreed, Rabin and Peres agreed basically to place the whole issue of Jerusalem on the table, on the negotiating table. This is a subject for discussion. It will undoubtedly come up at some stage if and when we ever get back to a negotiating mode. But when we were discussing with Arafat the issue of Jerusalem, Professor Ruth Lapidot suggested that perhaps because Arafat came and said, look, nobody will permit me to compromise on the issue of Jerusalem. The Saudis are threatening me. They're considered to be the king of Saudi Arabia is the king of Jerusalem. The king of Morocco is the king of Jerusalem. Everybody has got an interest in Jerusalem. The Jordanians consider themselves, have got the agreement of the Israelis to be involved in Jerusalem. I can't negotiate the status of Jerusalem. And by the way, the Pope said the same thing to us. He said, if you Jews and Arabs think that you too can divide up Jerusalem, then you forget there's 1 billion Catholics who are also interested in Jerusalem, and so we want to be involved in Jerusalem. And by the way, the World Jewish Congress, Edgar Bronfman then wrote a letter to Arik Sharon saying, hey, if you Israelis think that you can determine the sole fate of Jerusalem, then you forget that there's the Jewish community. There are about 13 million Jews throughout the world that see Jerusalem as part of their basic Judaism, and therefore we want to be involved in these negotiations. So that it was as I said, hot potato is to minimize the problem. But Arafat said, look, I can't do this. So Ruth Lapidot, when we were sitting in our room, she suggested, look, Alan, draft up a provision which says that Jerusalem should remain in the hands of God. And then when the time comes, it'll be determined. Nobody can argue about that. So I drafted up a provision in legalese saying, and I quote, and I got it in my own handwriting, the two sides agree with respect to Jerusalem that the holy places to Jerusalem will remain in the hands of God, square brackets, Allah, square brackets, Hashem. When he, square brackets, she, materializes on this earth, then the two parties will accept whatever determination he, square brackets, she, will make with respect to the holy places and to Jerusalem. In the meantime, the present status quo, including Israeli administration of the area, will continue in accordance with the provisions of the detached annex. And we gave this to Arafat. And Arafat, who you can say a lot about him, but he had a sense of humor. He smiled and he said, you know what? I can't accept this, obviously, take it back. But if I were to accept this, then within 2 or 3 days, they'd kill me. Somebody would kill me. Now, I don't mind being killed. I'd be a shaheed, and I'd have whatever rewards shaheeds have. But for agreeing to compromise on Jerusalem, they declare that I'm not a shaheed, that I'm a great traitor, and I'll go directly to hell. And so therefore, I'm not the man that's going to agree to compromise on Jerusalem. And that was the end of that negotiation. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions if anybody wants to ask Michal or myself. Yes, please.
Yes,
could you just speak up and give your name?
In regard to your statement that there is nothing more permanent than that which is temporary, facilitating a kind of de facto separation of a division of Jerusalem with these walls that we're putting up now in defense of the attacks on us. Are we in some way facilitating those who think that we should have divided the city long ago?
No, I wouldn't want to get in. Thanks very much. I wouldn't want to get into whether what's happening today is wise. You know, when I refer to temporary, I refer to internationally temporary. In other words, you know, the UN established in 1948 UNSO, and it still exists today, and the states are still paying. Israel is still paying 0.12% of the budget of UNSO, and the US are paying 22% of the budget, and the Russians are paying 10% of the budget, and nobody's saying anything about it, nobody's doing anything about it, and the State Department seem to be quite happy with this, as is the Foreign Office and the French. That's when I say temporary, I mean temporary. What's happening today is simply indicative of the problem of Jerusalem that will probably calm down at some stage, but will come back, from time to time, because in a different paper that I've written, tracing back the issue of incitement, we have a publication on incitement, and we held a symposium here on incitement. I pointed to the fact that 100 years ago, or slightly less, the Mufti of Jerusalem raised the threat of the Jews to occupy Al-Aqsa as a reason for inciting Arabs to violence, and 33 Jews were killed, etc., etc. So it's nothing new. It has been in the past. It is at the moment, and unless some miracle occurs or some element of supreme wisdom invades the Arab persona, I can't see any change. Thank you. Next question. Yes, Dan.
Just an issue of clarification.
Speak up.
Just an issue of clarification. It seems from our neighbors, if you speak to the Jordanians and even the Palestinians, the issue about the issue of Jerusalem boils down to the Muslim holy shrines, as is being reflected in Al-Aqsa's endanger libel against Israel. This notion that we come up with, I think I counted 10 or 12 different legal political solutions that you had mentioned very eloquently, is somewhat, it is irrelevant to the Palestinians. It is irrelevant. If we were to offer everything in Jerusalem except for the Holy Basin, there would be no deal. So and this is what we hear from them. So this issue about dividing Jerusalem and what do we need the 28 Arab concentrations of population in Jerusalem is irrelevant to the Palestinian side. And therefore it seems that with regard to Jerusalem, the thinking has to be, how does one assert legitimacy over, together with the Jordanians, over the holy sites, the Temple Mount, as well as the Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem.
Didn't want so much to answer, but to make some related comment. Alan, you mentioned the Oslo Accords.
Speak in the microphone.
Yeah. You mentioned the Oslo Accords, and Jerusalem, as you said correctly, is one of the issues to be left for a final negotiation. However, Prime Minister Rabin, a month after the second Oslo Agreement, and as a matter of fact, it so happened that it was his last speech before he was assassinated in October 1995, his speech. He said that first and foremost, united Jerusalem as the capital of Israel under Israel's sovereignty. And then you, in this article of yours, made a very instructive observation, and you spoke about the distinction. It's not a zero-sum game. You said, whereas we have the Washington Declaration, and already by then the Peace Treaty of Jordan, and the whole question of the Muslim shrines were covered under the Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty. That's one thing. And then on the other side, we have the whole issue of sovereignty. So I think that was in the mind, as you said, Alan, in Rabin head when he was ready to speak about Jerusalem by that time. But he kept it undivided city under Israeli sovereignty.
Look, Dan, I didn't have time to go into great detail, but while we were preparing ourselves for the negotiations on Jerusalem, and Rabin set up a committee with Ruth Lapidot and myself and Maya Choshen, who spoke the other day, and various other senior people from Rabin's cabinet. We drew up a possible outcome, including a map, which has never really been published. It was leaked, and that was the reason that Rabin dismantled the group, because the Shas were then threatening that if Rabin starts negotiating Jerusalem, then they'll leave the coalition, and that will be the end. And so as soon as it was leaked by somebody, he dismantled this group, which was quite a shame, because we were we really delving into the various aspects of Jerusalem. And one of the things we talked about was the possibility of having some type of internationalization of the holy places with individual flags flying above the various shrines, churches, Western Wall, etc., without establishing some type of Palestinian sovereignty over this particular area, but having some type of joint acknowledgement of religious control or religious what's the word, autonomy by each region, which is more or less consistent with what's happening today. The Waqf today has, but it will be under some type of limitations and supervision. And whether the rest of the area will be divided or not divided, we have the paper by Nadav Shagai, who says, he details the disadvantages, the security disadvantages, the demographic disadvantages, the economic disadvantages of division. You just need to think about the Jerusalem airport, which is defunct, and it's now is being prepared as a building site for a housing project. Imagine the economic potential for the Israelis and Palestinians of operating an international airport for pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. It would be a huge economic endeavor, and we'd all benefit from it. So there are huge potential benefits. It just needs cool-headedness, pragmatism, and acknowledgement of mutual rights. And this is something that we don't have today. We perhaps had it in the past, but we don't have it anymore. And so, and I think that's probably the shura tachtuna, the bottom line of this whole issue. Until things calm down, and until we get some type of serious Palestinian leadership that is prepared to acknowledge the fact, not deny Jewish heritage in the area, but acknowledge the fact that the Jews have rights, and some type of acknowledgement by Israel. And we don't deny it, that there is a history of Muslim presence in the area since 700, since the year 700. We haven't denied this. So we have to find a way of joining these two together. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Michal.